We often hear debates about whether we should take ancient texts as seriously as modern opinions. And it's customary to deride atheists for saying things like, well, after all, the authors of the Bible, what did they know? They lived 2,000 years ago or more, and they didn't know all the things that we knew, that we now know. Now, I think that there is something naive about that view, and something perhaps even arrogant about the idea that we now know better than everybody and anybody else that lived a long time ago. But there is, in fact, a very interesting sense in which there is some truth to this idea that ancient texts are not going to bring us the kind of wisdom we need in the modern world. And the reason for that is, to put it very bluntly and briefly, that we actually have two brains, or as psychologists sometimes call them, two relatively independent and yet connected and sometimes conflicting systems of mental processing. The more ancient system of mental processing has had literally millions and perhaps a billion years to develop. And it's amazingly good at detecting how other people feel, at detecting what we should do in emergency situations, and in all kinds of ways, it's incredibly efficient. The modern system, which we've had for only a few tens of thousands of years, is the system that is based on explicit language-based reasoning. And it's clumsy, and it's slow, and it's inefficient. But it's the only kind of system of thought that will get you to the moon, that will get you to Mars, that will get your airplanes to fly. And essentially, I think the debate about the sacred is, in a way, a debate about whether we should continue to introduce in modern life those intuitions that we have from the first brain, or whether we should actually give them up. One of the things we get from this first brain is what somebody has called a hyperactive agency detection device, which means that primitive people, I know you're not supposed to say that, especially in noisy, primitive people, nevertheless, it is a primitive way of thinking, it is a childlike way of thinking, tend to see in everything that happens in nature the intention of some agent. Now, the fact about that is that there is no agent in nature. And science has progressed simply by completely giving up on the idea that lightning and thunder and tsunamis and earthquakes are caused by some intentional being. And that, in effect, is why we need to give up the sacred. What is the sacred? It's the idea that some beliefs or some values are absolute. And what does that lead to? Well, it leads to things like Khomeini deciding that you have to kill the author of a novel that he hasn't even read because it offends the sacred. It has to do with the Supreme Court of Canada deciding that Sue Rodriguez could not be allowed to kill herself when she wanted to, and when her life was thought by her no longer to be worth living. Although, of course, she's perfectly free to do so when she has no reason to. Why? Because they declared the right of a human being to have a dignified death is outweighed by the sacredness of human life. Now, what's wrong with that is that when you consider some value to be absolute, then you cannot afford to be tolerant of any other value. Because if you were, you'd just be compromising with evil. Therefore, the idea of the sacred is inimical to tolerance. Secondly, if you believe that values are absolute, then you're going to pretend that there is no decision to be taken. But there are decisions to be taken about the value of human life, for example. If you really believed that a human life was absolutely valuable, then you'd have to not only prevent anybody from owning a gun, you'd have to prevent anyone from owning a car. You could save 40,000 lives in the USA alone, and proportionately many in Canada, by banning cars, and about as many by banning guns. Why don't we? Well, because we don't really believe that human life is sacred. As a matter of fact, we don't really believe any of the stories that religious people believe. We pretend to believe them because it gives us an excuse not to think seriously about what we really should value and to what extent we should value things and what we need to sacrifice for what. So now, I want to say that you can, of course, keep all the best things about these ancient ways of thinking. You can keep the value of certain states which are brought about by the contemplation of poetry and stories. That's called art. That's illusion and the beauty of illusion. What you don't need is the delusion of religion. That is to say, what you don't need is actual belief. So I want to conclude, there is room for all kinds of things in human minds: diversity, mystical states. Yes, we should seek mystical states. Communion. Yes, we should seek community and communion. All of that. But there is no room for the sacred. Thank you.
The human mind is something that's shaped by the forces of biological evolution. Well, let's take that seriously for a moment. You're either a blank slate, rationalist, let's say, on which anything can be written whatsoever, or you actually have an intrinsic human nature. Now, you can't have it both ways. And what this means to me is that the dialogue between evolutionary biologists and people who theorize about religious beliefs has barely even begun. And the reason it hasn't yet begun is because the evolutionary biologists and the rationalists don't know a damn thing about religion. And their way around that is to make the most pathetic straw man possible out of the complex structure of ancient beliefs, attribute them to someone who has the mental capacity of a 13-year-old, and then proceed to use their high IQ to crush their opponents. Well, that's just not going to work, because the systems of thought that are derided by evolutionary biologists and rationalists are complex beyond belief, and they haven't spent the time unpacking them. Now, we'll leave that aside for a moment, and I'm going to go after a more central element of Dr. De Sousa's argument. He said there's no such thing as the sacred. Okay, so let me give you one thing that convinced me that there was something that was sacred. I started doing the studying that I've been doing because I was trying to solve the problem of what happened during the Nazi era and in the Holocaust. And what really got me was one story, and I read a story about Nazi prison guard in Auschwitz who had the Jewish prisoners who were already three-quarters dead and pretty much headed for death anyways, to carry wet sacks of salt from one side of the compound to another and then back again. 100-pound wet sacks of salt. So you see, that was something that was of absolutely no worth to anyone, right? And that was the demonstration that was being made by the guard. You could put someone in a god-awful situation and do whatever you want to make it worse. And I thought, now, good, I found my absolute, I found my thing that's sacred. That's wrong. Wrong. Period. And that was what the Nuremberg judgment said too, that that was wrong. There's some forms of behavior that, cross-culturally, above rationality, because you don't want to debate about the viciousness of Auschwitz. Some things are wrong, absolutely wrong. And that gives you a solid ground to stand on, right? Because as soon as you know that one thing is absolutely wrong, you've got your absolute. And then you can start thinking about what might be absolutely right. And even if you don't know what it is, here's a proposition. What it is the exact opposite pattern of behavior that led to the Holocaust and Auschwitz. And if we're going to take what happened in the 20th century seriously, then we better start thinking about morality seriously. And that debate has not started yet.
But the problem is that the Hitlers of this world, the Khomeinis of this world, the Inquisition of the Catholic Church in this world, all of these are equally certain of the rightness of their absolutes. And while I totally agree that in any given conversation we have to have some things that we can, all the interlocutors in the conversation, agree on, some things that we're not going to question for today. What is characteristic of the sacred, as opposed to the person who says, these values really matter to me, is that if you say these values really matter to me, you're sometimes ready to die for them. But it's only when you think they're sacred that you're ready to kill for them. I think it's an interesting linguistic fact that the word act of faith, that phrase, translates into Portuguese as auto da fé. You may recognize that phrase. Auto da fé is the word that designates the ceremony of burning heretics at the stake in order to do them good, in order to save them. That is what is called an act of faith. Now, faith, you see, is often praised by people of faith. People are admired for their faith. And what does that mean, admired for their faith? It actually means no more and no less that they are admired for being willing to continue to hold certain things to be true, which all the evidence and reason is against. That's what faith is. Mark Twain defined it rather succinctly as believing what you know ain't true. And that is exactly what faith is. And that is why it is different from science, which, however arrogant you may think that some scientists are, is surely no less arrogant than thinking that you have a direct line to the creator of the universe, and that the creator of the universe is specifically interested in whether you're now praying, taking its name in vain, or maybe illegitimately fornicating. Right? The point is that that is true arrogance. It's not arrogance to say, this is the best that I can do so far. And I'm open to refutation. I'm open to correction. I'm open to evidence. Now, in the piece that Jordan published this morning, he said something rather interesting about Nietzsche's death of God passage, that very famous passage in which Nietzsche said, we've killed God. He says Nietzsche was highly aware of the fact that pretenders will contend for the abandoned throne of God. Well, yes, but who was there in the first place? The real God? They were all pretenders, and they were all pretenders who precisely use the tendency that people have to believe such things and to hope that superstitions will save them. All of that is used by people who get the power to tell you that God wants you to do this or God wants you to do that. That's why we need to get rid not just of God. Of course we need to get rid of God, because the whole idea of God is really, if you think about it, just silly. But we need to get rid of the sacred. That is to say, we need to get rid of the idea that some things are forever beyond argument, beyond criticism, and beyond question.
Well, the first thing I would say is that Dr. De Sousa actually didn't address my point, because what I was trying to point out was that I could find one thing that to me seemed to be absolutely true. And it's a vicious thing, because you can decide on one side or the other. You could either decide that what the Nazis did was culturally sanctioned and therefore it was okay, or you can decide that it was wrong and it constituted a crime against humanity, which means that it violated a kind of universal moral ethic. Okay, but we'll leave that aside for now. Dr. De Sousa also brought up the specter of religious totalitarianism, right? Well, that's fine and fair enough. Totalitarianism is a danger. I would say it's actually a danger of a certain kind of temperament, because we now know enough about human biology and temperament to understand that people who are prone to totalitarian viewpoints have a particular kind of biological predisposition. They're very conscientious, they're very orderly. There's other things that go along with that are deeper in some sense than their particular kind of belief. And so totalitarians can emerge within any ordered structure of belief. But I'd also like to point out that he didn't really talk much about nihilism, and the danger of any kind of moral relativism is a descent into nihilism. And so I would say human beings always have to negotiate between the Scylla and Charybdis of nihilism on the one hand, which occurs when your beliefs dissolve, and totalitarianism on the other, which occurs when your beliefs become too rigid. And so then I would say that the equation of religious belief or admiration for the sacred with a tendency to be violent is, I'm sorry, we're just not going to have that argument anymore. And I'll tell you why. Because in the 1970s, Jane Goodall discovered something. And she discovered something that she suppressed for quite a long time because it was so damn shocking. And at this point, it was just after the 60s, and everybody was, pretty much convinced that human beings were basically good, and that we were basically something like a blank slate, and that if we were nasty and corrupt, it was because of our beliefs, or maybe because our culture corrupted us. And then Goodall discovered that, lo and behold, chimpanzees did territorial raiding and killed their enemies. Now, unless you're willing to believe that chimpanzees are doing that for religious purposes, you're pretty much stuck with having to deal with something that could be arguably more fundamental than motivation for killing the evil other than anything religious. And this is a real tough point, right? Lots of things died with Goodall's discovery. And one of the things that died was the idea that the reason that people were warlike was because of what they believed, right? It's deeper than that. If you take a rat out of his dominance hierarchy, and you wash him so he no longer smells like a rat, and you put him back into the rat hierarchy that's composed of his loving family, the other rats will immediately tear him to pieces. And the probability they're doing that, because he's now a heretical rat, is pretty much zero. Now, this is what I mean about evolutionary biologists wanting to have it both ways. The more we discover the roots of our own being, the farther back that we can trace it, the more we find out that human beings actually have a nature. Let me give you a recent example. There's a woman named Lynn Isbell who's been studying the development of vision in Southern California among primates. And here's something real cool. She discovered that human beings have the vision that they have, which is unbelievably good, by the way, for a mammal or a primate. It's second only to, say, a bird of prey. Isbell discovered that the more predatory snakes that were around as a primate evolved, the sharper the primate vision. And so Isbell wrote a very interesting book, and she's a very good scientist, by the way, called The Fruit, the Tree, and the Serpent. And what she claimed was that snakes in the garden gave us vision. Just out of curiosity, have you ever heard that before? Right. Here's another thing. You know why you have color vision? It's because your ancestors were fruit eaters. And so it says in Genesis that what gave human beings vision was the snake and the fruit. Well, guess what? That happens to be the case. And then with regards to the pseudoscientific stance, let's say, of religious belief, let's look at the Taoist symbol for reality. Okay? Black paisley, white paisley. The black paisley has a white dot in it, and the white paisley has a black dot in it. What does that stand for? It stands for chaos and order. And the reason it stands for chaos and order is because that's actually what being is made out of. Now, you might think that the world is made out of the objects that you see in front of you. But I can tell you one thing, the colors you see aren't part of the world. Your perceptions, which are evolved, in some sense blind you to realities that transcend your perception. Well, numbers are a good example. What's most stable across the millennia? Some things stay the same, and some things change. And being is made out of chaos and order, just as the Taoists thought. A very common idea across religious systems. So, for example, in Genesis, you see that God, whatever God happens to be, uses words, consciousness, intelligence, to extract habitable order out of chaos. That's a very common religious idea. And then you see something that's even more interesting in that story. You see that the Creator who does this also makes men and women in his image. And what does that mean? Men and women, interestingly enough, which is not necessarily something you'd expect for an archaic patriarchal viewpoint. What it means is that human beings use their consciousness to continually create order out of chaos, or to reduce order that's become pathological back to its chaos and recast it. And what that means is that our consciousness, or consciousness itself, participates in a radical way in bringing being to light. Now, you may know that there's an interpretation in quantum physics, for example, called the Copenhagen interpretation, and not everybody agrees with it, but according to the Copenhagen interpretation, no event is an actualized event until it's perceived. And the person who formulated that hypothesis, John Wheeler, is one of the most renowned physicists of the 20th century, and he believed, before he died, quite firmly that whatever consciousness is played an integral role in being. Now, it seems to me, after studying this for a very long period of time, that the entirety of Western civilization is predicated on the idea that there's something divine about individual consciousness. And after studying that for such a lengthy period of time and trying to figure out what it meant, I think I found out what it meant. I think it found out that the reason that our archaic stories say that human beings, men and women, are made in the image of God is because consciousness plays a central role in being itself. Modern people think the world is somehow simply made out of objects, and then they look at the world, and then they think about the world, and then they evaluate it, and then they act. And let me tell you, as a neuroscientist, that is wrong. There's no debate about it, it's just wrong. The first thing that you apprehend when you look at the world, and this is far before you make any conscious decision, is undifferentiated meaning. It takes you half a second of neural processing before you transform the chaos that's attracted your attention into the actual objects of the world. And you do that all the time you look around. And so the facts of the matter seem to be something more like this. The world is actually made out of potential. And that potential is actualized by consciousness, and we already all know this. So, for example, your mother probably said to you at one point, you should really live up to your potential. And you didn't say to her, Mom, the world's made out of objects. What sort of potential are you exactly talking about? You knew perfectly well what she meant. Potential is unrealized reality, and consciousness realizes it. And that's part of the reason it's divine.
I would like to make 4 really quick points. The first point is that all of that is lovely, but I don't see what it's got to do with our topic. The second is that I am absolutely not committed, and nor is any relativist committed, to nihilism. Nihilism is the view that there are no values. Relativism is the view that values depend on that very human nature that Jordan is so keen to stress. The third point is a factual point about which I'm sure he knows more than I do, but I have actually read that some of the violence that Jane Goodall uncovered may well have been due in part to the fact that she hadn't noticed that she had created a situation of scarcity among the primates she was studying. So that there was a big store of bananas from which the chimps came and got bananas, and in effect that created a completely new situation. So that an alternative, the standard interpretation of the fact that people hadn't noticed the violence before, is that they hadn't looked long enough. And people say, well, Jane Goodall came and she was so patient, she watched long enough. And indeed, you have to watch for thousands of hours before you find a murder, even among humans. And so if you watch long enough, you'd find murders among chimps or gorillas. However, that is factually questionable, but I don't think that's important. Fourthly, all of these bad things that we discover, and all of these interesting things that we discover that we can hook up to ancient myths, I simply want to say that they're best investigated by science. And that once we investigate them by science, which is exactly your job, it's what you do, you're extremely good at it. And you could not have uncovered the multifarious meanings of those stories by simply saying, well, I believe these stories. The whole point is that what you've done is to compare, is to think about how they relate to other things, and it is, in effect, to bring what I've called the second brain to bear on the first brain. And of course, none of this, absolutely none of it, gives you the slightest reason for supporting the idea that we need the sacred.
I never claimed that Dr. De Sousa is committed to nihilism. What I claimed was that nihilism and totalitarianism constitute two poles that human societies can disintegrate into, depending on whether or not they hold their beliefs too lightly or whether they hold them too rigidly. Now, the danger of constant and unquestioning questioning is that nihilism looms, just as Nietzsche said. And Nietzsche predicted, very precisely, I might add, that because of the emergent nihilism that the death of God would produce, that some tens of millions of Europeans were likely to die in the 20th century to sort out what might constitute acceptable post-Christian values. Well, you know, he predicted that about 40 years before it started to happen, and that's pretty remarkable. And so we live after the deaths of hundreds of millions of people in the 20th century, fought for various reasons, but I'm not accusing Dr. De Sousa of being a nihilist. I'm just pointing out that there's two forms of danger with regards to belief. Now, I also think that human beings have evolved, as a matter of fact, to deal with those two dangers. I think that when your nervous system, for example, detects that something is meaningful and moves you towards that place, what it's doing is attracting you to the midpoint between order and chaos. And that's the place where you're properly secure because enough of what you know is stable, but properly curious, so you're maximizing information flow into your system so that you can remain adapted. I would also claim very directly, and I think there's neurological and psychoanalytic evidence to suggest this, that you experience that particular locale as a state that's associated with optimized being. And I would also claim that religious systems that stress the divinity of the individual not only describe how cosmically important, in a sense, consciousness is, but also that if you follow what manifests itself to you as meaning, that you will occupy exactly the right point between totalitarian totality and nihilistic chaos. And I would also say that you all know that already, because if you watch your life day after day and the manner in which your being unfolds, you'll find that frequently you occupy a state that you would like to continue to occupy. And I would say that state itself is not a rational construction. That state is something that your embodied being reveals to you. And that if you want to stay in a place like that, which is really quite a good idea, that you have to watch to see how it is that you do that and try to repeat it. Now, you know, Ronnie objected that my comments had nothing to do with the topic, and, you know, I might suggest that he actually didn't understand them because they were dead on relevant to the topic. I'm pointing out that the body that you inhabit has evolved over such a long period of time that the reality that's adapted to is precisely the interplay between order and chaos. And when you balance those properly, life reveals an intrinsic meaning to you that's so powerful that it can act as a counterposition to all the tragedy that's also characteristic of life. We're actually adapted to those two realities. And that's why the descriptions of those realities are held as sacred across so many cultures. So, you know, and you can try it and see how it works. I mean, it's an empirical process in a sense Watch what you're doing when your life is worthwhile, and maybe even more importantly, watch what you're doing when your life isn't worthwhile and when you're becoming bitter and cruel and maybe even murderous. And you'll find out pretty quickly that there's a real difference between those two states, and that difference is so profound that it's not merely rational. Now, I would also like to talk about Goodall, because Ronnie's actually absolutely wrong about that. The reason that Goodall took her findings and held them for a number of years was because she was precisely convinced that perhaps there was exactly the problem that Ronnie laid out. She thought that the chimps might have been corrupted, you know, in a sense by human contact, but more importantly that their environment had been disrupted because of the human intrusion. So Goodall suppressed the results, or maybe she was very cautious about them, and that's fine. But it didn't take very long until primatologists across Africa were reporting exactly the same thing, even among chimpanzee troops that had never been studied by humans. And so we know pretty well, and you can read the primatology yourself, we know pretty well that chimps do raiding, and that there's absolutely no limit whatsoever on the force that they're willing to use on an outsider. Now, you know, it's convenient for rationalists, especially of the evolutionary type, to use religion as the whipping boy for all the ills of the world. But if you took your damn evolutionary biology serious and you read enough of it, you'd stop doing that, because it just doesn't hold water. The sorts of things that you accuse the religious of doing are so fundamental that they precede religion. And the facts are already in, guys. There's no more debate about this. We've known it since the early 70s. So if you want to take the problem seriously, you know, you got to start addressing the root causes and quit playing this juvenile game.
I take the point about nihilism, and certainly I didn't mean to say that I was being accused of being a nihilist. I was just pointing out that there is no need to take totalitarianism and nihilism as a kind of choice that we have to make, regardless of what our attitude is to the sacred. That we can try and work our way through to a reasonable accommodation, whatever our beliefs about the sacred. Now, and I also take your point about Jane Goodall. It's just, I think it's actually not a point that needs to divide us, because I completely agree that these impulses are embedded in our nature. But you see, that exactly makes my point about what I call the first system of thought. Because we get murderous aggression perfectly understandably from our evolutionary history. It's a perfect, like rape. People are often shocked when somebody says, well, maybe rape is just a successful evolutionary strategy, and that's why men are actually tempted to rape. Now, the point is, that's only shocking if you assume that there's something lovely about nature. But nature is a horrible, horrible thing. And indeed, that's why people invented religion, to try and placate those horrible, horrible gods that were doing all these awful things to us. You try to pretend to think they're nice. That is my very, 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 very amateurish explanation for monotheism and the idea that God is good. God is obviously bad if God exists, right? So you know, when you have a really nasty boss, you kind of suck up. That seems to me to be all sort of the long and the short of this complicated story.
Look, okay, sorry, all right, so, look, this is exactly...
Let me say one more thing about rationality, right? Because it seems to me, see, of course I'm all for integrating and understanding the role that our nature plays in our behavior, including our bad behavior. But I think that can best be done by giving up on the idea that values are to be held sacred, as opposed to being really important and being open to discussion between those who hold these values and those who hold these other values.
So this is partly a descent into rhetorical trickery, right? Because, and I mean that formally, because Ronnie's making a straw man again, and that's not reasonable. Now here I'll tell you why. So first of all, God is good. Well, I don't know if you read the Old Testament. But the people who wrote that didn't really have a primitive view of whatever transcendent reality was. They knew that if you stepped out of line at the wrong time, it would crush you like a bug. There's no attempt to paint over that, you know. And if religious people, for example, are so concerned about transforming cruel reality into something that's, you know, primitively benevolent, you've got to ask yourself why in the world medieval people were torturing themselves with the idea of hell. Because there's nothing that's really comforting about that. So you're not going to get away with a simple Freudian, you know, religion equals primitive way of reducing the death wish, because it just doesn't hold up. Now, with regards to another thing he said, he talked about placating God, okay? So one of the things that you see across human cultures is human cultures almost universally use sacrifice. And that can be really bloody, you know. So the Aztecs, for example, sacrificed some 25,000 people a year to their god, you know, and well, I'm not really in favor of that. That's not precisely my point, but I'll tell you something, because I've studied sacrifice for a long time. Arthur Koestler, for example, a journalist in the 60s, wrote a book called The Ghost in the Machine, and he claimed that the widespread practice of human sacrifice, which is really cross-cultural, was indication that, you know, something really serious had gone wrong in our evolutionary history, and that we were basically insane. You know, that self-consciousness drove us as a species insane. And, you know, that's a pretty harsh claim, but if you're thinking about 25,000 hearts ripped out by the Aztecs every year, you know, and all the other crazy things that people do, you know, you might lend it some credence. But here, look at it this way. Human beings can change the future, consciously. And that's pretty weird, you know. We don't exactly know how we do that. You look at the future, and there's some possibility here, and there's some possibility there, and you want to go there, and you don't want to go there. So I ask my students all the time, what did your parents sacrifice so that you could go to university? Well, they put up their hands and they say, well, you know, they saved and they scrimped and they moved from China and, you know, they had to start here as immigrants and they sacrificed all that so that, well, so that what? So that reality would shine its benevolent face on their offspring. And so you can make fun of the idea of sacrifice all you want, but you all understand it. Now, you're a little more abstract than your ancestors were, you know, and they had to act this out in a dramatic way because they didn't have the same kind of psychologically sophisticated conceptual understanding that's standard now. But I'll tell you, the fact that you can think psychologically about sacrifice is a consequence of eons of work done by your progenitors in the attempt to solve an unbelievably difficult problem. And although they might have made some mistakes along the way, and, you know, let's not assume, you know, let's assume that we're doing precisely the same thing, they certainly got us to where we are now. And you tell me whether or not you believe that if you sacrifice the right things in the present, that God, the transcendent reality, is more likely to shine his face on you in the future. Well, whether you say you believe it or not, I don't care, because what I think what constitutes what you believe is not what you say, but how you act. And the probability that you all act that out in some form or another is 100%.
You are, as you said, psychologically sophisticated. What that means is that we now understand these things in the light of rational science. That isn't, that doesn't mean that we need to, as it were, be a participant observer in all the rubbish that is done in the name of the sacred. You can understand this without believing any of it. And frankly, you don't believe any of it, right? You don't believe, you believe the psychological statements that you've made, but you don't actually literally believe any of the things that people say about God, about the effectiveness of sacrifice when it's not in those nice everyday instances that you've given. In other words, you don't really believe in God or the gods or any supernatural entities, as far as I can tell. And therefore, I think there's something a little, I don't know, patronizing about your saying that, you know, people need this because otherwise their lives will be chaotic. Well, look, lots of people do this commuting between the chaos and the order by being artists or by consuming art. And I repeat, the difference between art and religion is that art is illusion and religion is delusion. And that, I think, is really all I need to say.
Well, the first thing, no, I won't say that. It's not that easy to draw a line between delusion and illusion, by the way. So I mean, they're not naturally bounded categories. And the idea that there's a categorical difference, say, between art and religion is far from obvious. I mean, here's how I look at it. You have your rational domain, and in that rational domain are the things that you understand well enough to talk about, and also the things that you understand well enough so that when you act them out, it works. But that's a pretty limited domain, and the only reason that you can inhabit it at all, generally, is because the world is set up, the cultural world is set up, to make things pretty easy for you. Insofar as things can be easy for people. Surrounding that domain of what you know is a different kind of domain, and that's the domain that's halfway between what you know and what you don't know. And in that domain there are dreams, for example, that guide you. We know, for example, that what dreams do is help you move information that you don't understand into systems you do understand without traumatizing you. In that domain are religious ceremonies and drama and literature and art, and all these things that are quasi-rational in a sense, but that constitute the sort of amoeba-like pseudopods that we extend out from what we're comfortable with into the domain that we know nothing about. And everything that we know went through this sort of process. It emerges out of the unknown through the dream into the light of rationality. And for Ronnie to say that there's a clear division between what constitutes illusion and what constitutes delusion is the sort of thing you'd expect to hear from someone who hasn't actually dealt with people who either have illusions or delusions, right? And I see people all the time in my clinical practice who are suffering in all sorts of different ways. And I know for a fact that many of those people suffer for reasons that are best construed in religious terms. They have crises of meaning. In their own households, religious wars are going on between what constitutes the appropriate set of ultimate values. And you can't remove problems like this by reducing them to, what would you say, a polite, rational debate about the relative value of one idea against another.
What is rationality? Rationality is not just using logic to derive your conclusions from set premises. Rationality is not just refusing to acknowledge the importance of emotions. Rationality, hell, I wrote a book called The Rationality of Emotions. Right? Rationality is just finding the means to whatever your goals are that are most likely to succeed. And if your goals have to do with, say, achieving certain actions, then rationality has to do with choosing the best means. If your goal is to achieve a certain mental state, then the rationality is going to be to try and move in the direction of presenting to yourself the world in such a way that those states will result. And none of this requires me to deny any of the psychological facts that you've stressed, any of the biological facts that you've stressed. And they only leave, and I think they do leave, entirely open the question of well, actually, no, they close the question in my favor of, do you need anything to be sacred? And the answer is, you don't.
People have to maintain order, so there's sort of a sacredness of order, and they have to adapt to chaos and change, and so there's sort of a sacredness of chaos, and then more fundamentally, there's something that's more active that constitutes the path of weaving your way properly through both of those, and that's a sacredness of transformation. And so, when people generally talk about religion, especially evolutionary biologists, they concentrate more on the totalitarian end of the distribution, but, there's no reason that necessarily has to be the case, because, I mentioned the archetype, say, the archetype of the dying and resurrecting Savior. It's like that's not an archetype of stability, it's an archetype of transformation. And so, that's a major religious system. It's embodied in Christianity. It's an older idea than that, and it's clearly a gesture in the direction of radical change. So we have to balance keeping things stable, and we have to let things change, and we have to figure out how to do that. It's not easy. I would say the sense of meaning that evolution, for all intents and purposes, has blessed you with is precisely the pre-rational mechanism that allows you to do that kind of maneuvering. So, and I would say that attending to that is actually a sacred duty. How about that? And I think you guys know that. You like to do meaningful things or not meaningful things, right? Do you believe in meaning? Well, yes or no. Are there things you do that are meaningful, and are there things that are not? So here's a little experiment. For the next year, just try to do things that are meaningful and see what happens. And then you can think a little bit more about whether ancient religious systems have anything to say about what constitutes the essential values in life. It's hard, you know. People, they deny their responsibility. They don't do that. They take the easy way out. And the consequence of taking the easy way out is that things are a hell of a lot worse than they could be. And you know, it's everybody's fault if they're not doing what they know they should be doing. And everyone knows that. And that's a sacred truth. So deny it if you want, but you know bloody well it's accurate.
I know it too. But it's not a sacred truth.
It's either universal or it's not, and if it's universal, then it's as close to it's close enough to sacred for me. You know, I don't really care. I don't really care if the rocks agree or the trees agree, but as long as all the people agree, that'll do the trick.
I'm really sorry, I didn't hear the question. Did you hear the question? Can you help me?
The questioner asked basically if by losing the conception of the sacred or by transposing it into secular terms, we lose the sense that there's something valuable beyond us, and that's liable to deprive us of a kind of necessary hope.
Right. The answer is no.
Look, I'll try to give you maybe a more serious answer. Okay.
I'm totally serious. No, come
I
on now.
Sorry.
You've been so nice
answer.
so far.
A longer
Don't
answer.
spoil it now.
Sorry.
This is a totally serious answer.
Okay.
And it is implied by everything that I said about art and science. And I think that if you look at, for example, you can look at recent work by a man called Kaufman, who has written a book called Reclaiming or Rehabilitating the Sacred, by which he means, and he and I have had a conversation about whether he should use that word, but his point is that the contemplation of the mysteries that are revealed and explored by science is something that can definitely give you any estates that are just as wonderful and transcendent and important as anything you can get from religion. Because despite all the wonderful things that Jordan finds in religion, when he interprets these things, the fact is the stories are pretty basic, the stories are pretty boring, and the story of the cosmos, the story of the Big Bang, the story of evolution, the greatest show on earth, Dawkins, I think, quite rightly heard it. Now, those are really exciting stories. And so, far from thinking that eliminating the sacred is going to cut off our sense of there being something greater and more wonderful, it's exactly the opposite. That's why I want to eliminate the sacred. So again, I say no.
So, in one of my classes, I show my students Pinocchio, you know, the Disney movie. And the story opens up with a puppet, right? And the puppet marionette is something that's having its strings pulled by forces it doesn't understand. And the maker of that puppet, that's Geppetto, you know. So you can think about him as a stand-in for God the Father, if you'd like, because he creates this thing that's not quite formed. And because Geppetto is a good father, he wishes on a star that his son could become real. Now, every good father wishes that, by the way, and Geppetto says, like every father does, that's pretty bloody unlikely. The probability that you're going to stay a puppet with things manipulating you behind the scenes is really high. But because Geppetto's a good guy, he wishes that, and then nature and culture conspire together to make it happen. Right now, one of the morals of that little story, and there are many, is that in order to have the best possible thing happen, that you have to lift your eyes above the local and look into the transcendent. Now, in that story, that takes the form of a star. It's something distant and maybe even something awe-inspiring, as Ronnie pointed out. But the point of the film, and everyone understands this when they watch it, whether they notice they understand it or not, is that for the best of all possible things to happen, and in this case it's that a true individual is born, it's necessary to start by establishing a relationship with something that's transcendent. Now, all of you have watched Pinocchio, right? And you fell right into it. But I bet you didn't understand it. And it doesn't matter, because it affected you at a level that's so damn deep that it captured your attention and you watched it, even though, just for the sake of argument, you might note that it involves a puppet rescuing his father from a whale. Now, you can understand that. Now, that's kind of strange, don't you think? Because it's as irrational as can possibly be. And my point is fundamentally that the reason you can understand things like that is because you have a religious substructure, whether you know it or not. And so you might as well know it, because if you knew it, things would work better.